Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You're very welcome to the Centre Culturel, to this last conversation and our last evening of what has been, for me personally, a fantastic festival. We've had wonderful conversations, and I'd like to just take the chance to thank all of the writers present here on stage, but also in the audience and exploring Paris. And I hope you'll enjoy this last session, which will be chaired by Wesley Hutchinson, who is a long-time friend of the Centre Culturel Irlandais and has recently retired from Paris 3, the Nouvelle Sorbonne. And I'm going to hand over to him to make the introductions.
Thank you very much, Nora. Thank you. This evening we're going to be talking about true crime, and particularly about the ethical issues surrounding incidents of often horrendous violence and murder in fiction and in other forms. And the people on the stage here with me are ideally placed to talk about that. So I'd like just to say, give you a few words of introduction to each one. Niamh O'Connor here in the centre worked for the Sunday World for many years. Sunday World is an Irish paper, one of the greatest distributions in the country. She was in charge of the crime section there and produced a considerable number of books on individual cases in the course of her period there. She brought out things like The Black Widow on the Nevin murder. And again, I'm sorry, sir, more recently, an appalling case that shocked, I think you could say, the country. But there's also crime fiction, and in particular, a detective, Joe Birmingham, in a series there. And we'll be talking about some of those books like Blink later on. Then Sam Bungey over here, Sam and Jennifer Ford, who unfortunately can't be with us this evening. Jennifer has worked as a producer on films with the BBC, for example, with Louis Theroux, the National Geographic. Sam has worked in the field of web, print and broadcast journalism, not only here in Ireland, shall we say, this is almost a piece of Ireland here, but also in Australia. And together they worked on, therefore, as writers, producers and hosts of a 13-part podcast series produced by Audible Originals. It runs to some 9 or 10 hours, I think, all in all, on the Sophie Toscan de Plantier murder. And lastly, Eoin McNamee, who, of course, has written a number of novels, one of the best known being Resurrection Man at the beginning of the 1990s on the Shankill Butchers, and most of the work has been indeed on the area of true crime, for example, with the Blue Tango that we'll be talking about a wee bit perhaps later on, the Ultras on Captain Nairac, and 1223 based on the final days of Lady Diana Spencer. And he also writes books for children, indeed, which is a wonderful opening as well. I don't know whether we're talking about that tonight. I hope not, in the case of true crime. So anyway, that gives you an idea as to the people that we have and their expertise and the variety of genre, therefore, that we're looking at this evening. And so I would just have, get the ball rolling with one initial question to all three of you. I was checking statistics today, thinking about this this evening, about how many murders are actually committed in Ireland, you see. And so I've got figures for like 2015, 2016, because there's a border in Ireland, you see. You have to add up the people that are murdered in the south and the people who are murdered in the north. Well, there are about 71 people murdered in the south and 16 in the north in 2015, 2016. So a total about 90 people who were murdered in Ireland, therefore, over that period. And my question is, why do you choose a particular one? Voila. Could you answer that? In other words, what's the switch, if you like, that makes you think that one?
It's always the most, you always know it instantly, and I don't know how you know it. It's the story that people are talking about in the office. It's the story that is appearing on the front of newspapers. It's the most unlikely story. So it's the woman who has it all and still murders her husband because she can. It's you know what I mean. It's a morality tale. It's the archetype. It's the sweet 16-year-old who is murdered, and everyone knows who this girl is and wants to know why. Because the problem with, or the issue with true crime is, you instantly know who done it, but you don't know why. And I know the authors were talking about that earlier, but it's. It goes so far back. It goes back to those chapbooks in the Elizabethan era and the broadsides, and at the side of the scaffolds, you know, what people want to read is the confessions, and they want to see the court reports. They want the detail, and it's the ones that capture the imagination. And then Truman Capote came along and decided this stuff is actually literary, it's not pulp. It's important, it's telling us something about what we have become and who we are. And he made it respectable. But there were literary authors all the while who were fascinated by it. And Nathaniel Hawthorne used to have his penny press shipped over to Liverpool. Edgar Allan Poe, Mark Twain, they were all fascinated, but they weren't allowed to be because it was considered kind of dirty and cheap. But it's the essence of what makes us who we are, really. So,
why did you choose the Toscan? Because you spent a long time working on this, didn't you? So it was a major commitment in terms of time and effort. Why did you choose that?
Yeah, it was, and probably, in fact, definitely a much longer and larger commitment than we originally planned or envisioned. But actually, it was funny you're mentioning the murder rate in Ireland, because in 1996, when Sophie Toscan de Plantier was killed, it was a big topic in the media in Ireland, which we sort of noticed during the research, that because there had been a big jump in the rate to the number that sticks in my head is 67, and a lot of those cases were involved like brutal violence against women. So it was already in the newspapers a lot, and it was in these year-end articles asking what had happened to this country. And obviously that number is tiny in comparison to many other countries. But and then Sophie's case sort of never left the headlines in Ireland, but and so it was a case that like captivated the country, but not we weren't aware of it, Jennifer and I. But so the question is like, what drew us to this story?
To that particular one.
Yeah. So we weren't neither of us have a history of like reporting or doing documentaries about crime, and we weren't really looking for a story like that. But I think there was a lot about it that we were captivated by, or like that we felt were sort of compelled to report on. But I think the thing that stuck us at it, I think, is this situation where you have someone who lives in a small community that essentially believes him guilty of murder, and he is sort of incapable of convincing them otherwise, but also refuses to leave, and it's sort of that was it. That's enough, but there was loads of other things too.
And there you're talking about Ian Bailey, who was the chief suspect, who has been the chief suspect for the past 22 years, indeed. Because when you went over to Ireland at the beginning, you weren't intending to stay, because you spent an entire winter, and then you spent an entire summer, and you're going backwards and forwards, and the detail in the podcast is really extraordinary, because it goes on, for a very long listen, and it's absolutely fascinating, the piecing together of the information. So it was a major commitment for both of you, indeed.
Yeah, absolutely. It was, but doing the story as a podcast rather than, so Jennifer's, as you mentioned, her background is in documentary television, but I think the fact that we were telling an audio story, which involves just a microphone and sort of committing enough time to doing it, like a little recorder, that allowed us to spend all that time there. I don't think you could have done it with the costs and also just the sort of intrusion that comes with big cameras everywhere and so on. But yeah, it was it kind of kept drawing us in loads of different ways, but that sort of intractable question about Ian Bailey and his either plight or anyway strange extreme situation was sort of the thing that kept us trying to figure out what the hell is going on, basically.
Indeed, thank you. And Eoin, because you're going from the Shankill Butchers, you're looking at the Curran affair, you're looking at Nairac, you're looking at Diana, what are the, and then you come back to Curran again, didn't you, more recently?
In 3 books, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, all I can really say is that these particular stories demanded to be told that way. When I wrote Resurrection Man about the Shankill Butchers, I almost falsified it at the end. I changed all the names, but it was obviously the Shankill Butchers. And then when I came to write The Blue Tango, it seemed something coy and dishonest about changing the names at the end. So I went with the names and went with my publisher's extremely expensive libel lawyer as well. But when you ask, and actually there's a relevance to Sam here, because when I said I want to write a book about Sophie Toscan de Plantier, the publisher just looked at me and went, no. And I realised afterwards it was probably the price of the libel lawyer that was going through his head. I can't think of any other reason why he would turn it down. But The Blue Tango is a different in a way. The murder of 19-year-old Patricia Curran, the willful, beautiful daughter of a very prominent judge, she was found on the driveway to her father's house, stabbed 32 times, in a case where it seems that her father tried to cover up her murder by some means. And there's quite obvious trails of evidence pointing to this. Unsolved, a young man was falsely convicted of the murder and found not guilty by reason of insanity, has conviction overturned in 2000. I always want to write about it, and there are several reasons, but I couldn't find a way into it until I heard that Ian Hay Gordon, the young man who was falsely convicted, when he was being interviewed by a grandstanding Scotland Yard detective called John Capstick, who told him he would tell his mother he was gay if he didn't confess to murder. But he said that during the interview he whistled this tune, which was in the charts at the time, in intervals between it to keep his spirits up, and it was The Blue Tango. And that was the noir feel to the book. It wasn't just a title, it was the very essence of the book, The Blue Tango. I mean, you can say it was a reference to Black Dahlia and all those kind of cases. But the other thing was, I went on, I wrote 3 interlinked books, one about another case where Mr. Justice Kern, the girl's father, presided over, and then another case where he was a young QC, and back, it's almost kind of prequel to the other 2. I mean, the spirit of my father goes through these books, who was a lawyer, so kind of quite a brilliant man who went off the rails, went very badly off the rails, and ended his life, didn't end his life, but died, I suppose, in many ways, kind of corrupted by his profession, I think was probably the best way to put it. But so because then I was interested in that territory that he emerged from, in those shadows, which was the time of the murder. But actually, the real genesis of the 3 books, and I only realised this about a year ago, it just this memory flashed back into my head. In what they call the hot press in Ireland, the kind of the warm cupboard, if you like, there was a drawer, and where my father's collar studs were kept. When he started off as a lawyer, they were the high celluloid collars, and there were studs to hold them in. And lining the bottom, and this, I just think it flashed into my head, lining the bottom of the drawer was that very, very haunting photograph of this beautiful girl taken, we assume, maybe with a year of her death. Her eyes very dark, the photograph's not very well exposed, these full lips and downturned mouth. An old Belfast Telegraph, an old local newspaper, yellowed, cracked, and the caption was "Judge's Daughter Slain." And that was where the 3 books came from, and I didn't realise it, I didn't know.
That's really interesting, indeed, yes. That actually ties in very well with the question I was going to ask you a wee bit later on in relation to Resurrection Man, but we'll get there in a second if you bear with me. The ethics, therefore, of using true crime for fiction, or presenting the results of a really intense, investigation, like in journalism or in the podcast. And people are very divided, on the issue. On the one hand, there's a clear market for this material. The people read your books with great interest, and they read your articles, with great interest. The books are selling, very well. There's a real market there. The podcast was described by the Irish News, I think, as addictive. Was the word the Irish Examiner as addictive was the term they used. On the other hand, you've got people who are deeply disturbed by the work. There's allegations of bad taste, sensationalism, provocation, preying basically on people's suffering. And this kind of reaction is particularly intense with regard to fiction, and thinking about Blue Tango. You were talking about Blue Tango in Ballymena about a year ago, and I happened to be there because Ballymena is the in place to be, and I was in the audience, and there were people there who were quite upset, about some of the stuff that you were doing. And Resurrection Man is another thing, with the intensity, if you like, of the reactions of the families of the victims. And you must understand people's reactions. What do you say to them?
Well, no one has ever delivered the kind of killer blow and put up the reason why I shouldn't do this. But I struggled with the ethics of it myself, and I realised a while ago that really what I do, and when I take it for people and put words in their mouths that they didn't speak, and set up relationships that didn't happen, and mix fictional people in with real people, there's a sense in people sort of look to writers as always to be a priest, that you have moral authority in society, but you don't have that kind of authority, and you shouldn't have that kind of authority. And it's an old-fashioned, I suppose now it's an old-fashioned term. I realize that if I do anything wrong, and I probably have done, I probably have overstepped the mark, that it's, in that old-fashioned term, it's a sin. It's something for which I answer for personally to whoever you answer to for your sins as a human being, not as a writer or as some kind of authority in society. I mean, I probably have. On the other hand, particularly when you talk about the Shankill Butchers, and you talk about a book like The Ultras about Robert Narek, but more about the covert war in the north, what you're trying to do is saying things so that they are never unsaid again. And that has a moral dimension, that, you know, to actually speak some kind of truth about these events. I met Senator Maurice Hayes, who was in Eminence Grease, both sides of the border. He was kind of in both governments at one stage, a very senior civil servant, but a man who knew, literally and metaphorically, where the bodies were buried. And he said in the ultras about the covert war, he said, you know, art, writing, fiction is the only way we're ever going to get close to what happened. And I thought that was a cop-out. But in actual fact, I kind of realized he was in the know. He knew that they were destroying the documentation, that the evidence was being destroyed, that people were covering up massively. I mean, they destroyed all the records of the main barracks in Armagh, Gough barracks, where all the interrogations, deep interrogations were carried out, because they were supposedly contaminated with asbestos. You know, tens of thousands of files disappeared, and he knew that was going on. So, yes, I mean, there is a responsibility, but it works on both sides as well.
Thank you. Niamh, we were talking about your book, Blink, just a few in the introduction. And Blink is about, it's a novel, and well, you explain better than me.
Because so long ago.
What I'm interested in getting at is that there's a quote at the back of the book, right? You've got an author's note at the end of the book, and you say the following thing. You say, we're all familiar with the cases. These are cases of teenage suicide, right? There was a huge spike, is the term in English, of teenage suicides in Ireland at the time, and we're all familiar with the cases that have made national headlines. I won't name them or go into detail here, because this is a work of fiction, and it wouldn't feel right or fair to package them with what's supposed to be a pot boiler. Now, why did you feel, because, you know, you're working on real crime. That was your job. And here you're doing fiction, and so here you're pulling back. Why the disclaimer?
Because suicide traditionally was something that newspapers never touched, because it was considered, you know, so awful and tragic and so hard on the families, and there was no crime technically, so it was a tradition that suicide was not touched. And so the dialogue was never had. And when you were talking there, you know, it occurred to me that the crime, if you believe, as our legal system does, that the crime is a crime against the state, then the role of the journalist and the true crime writer is to try and dissect and understand what has happened. And as offensive and unfair and unethical as that is to a family, and vulgar and obscene, and it is all those things. And I think Janet Malcolm said in her book, The Journalist and the Murderer, that the journalist who tries to defend it is just stupid or full of themselves, and so you can't defend it. And so in Blink, I was going into territory I was trying to write about the paralysis of the teenager in terms of their power against this social media, you know, mob culture, where you couldn't escape the classroom when you went home. There was no escape from it, and that was why I felt the need to put in the disclaimer.
Sam, some while ago I was reading a really interesting article by this guy called Siún Hanrahan, and Hanrahan had been given access to the Royal Ulster Constabulary's archive of all the crimes that had been committed during the Troubles period. And they've got this huge archive of material, notes and photographs and everything. And he was given access, one of the rare people to be given, and he wrote the article in Source, which is, by the way, an excellent magazine, photographic magazine published in Belfast, one of the best in the UK and Ireland. he says that, he was going through these things and he talking about the horrendous detail, the meticulous detail that came out. And he talked about the anxiety that he felt reading it. And he said that the reason he felt so ill at ease was because he knew that he wasn't supposed to be reading this, or he wasn't supposed to be seeing this, and that there was a code, if you like, for this, that the police dealt with that, or the jury and the judge dealt with that, but not him. And so I was just thinking, when I was reading it and listening to the podcast, that I felt when I was listening to the podcast that I was a member of the jury, and all of this information was being submitted to me, for my consideration. Would you like to say something about that? Was that the aim of the thing, or was there something else? The reason why you decided to make 13 podcasts, some of them running to 49 minutes. It's very detailed, and you get information in one that's contradicted by something else, and then it's re-contradicted by someone else, and you're going constantly in and out of this story.
That's a really, really interesting kind of observation of himself, that writer. I think, so first of all, in terms of the structure of the thing we put together, just to say that the story, the case that we're talking about is the murder of Sophie Toscan de Plantier, who was a French woman who was murdered in West Cork, in a kind of isolated part of Southwest Ireland. And there was an investigation that involved local police at first, and then a large number of police from all around the country, and resulted in an arrest, two arrests of this guy called Ian Bailey, who lived in the area, against whom there was no forensic evidence, no hard evidence, but a lot of kind of circumstantial evidence. And he wasn't charged. There wasn't enough to charge him, and he then remained in this small community and has been there since. And so the way that this investigation has then, since that sort of initial 6-week period, has played out in Ireland, it's played out in the media in a sort of unbelievably step-by-step way. It's rarely out of the papers. Even like I have a Google alert for Ian Bailey, and he's in the paper basically, at least every week. And we felt that to do the case justice, if we were going to do a journalistic treatment of it, we should tell it chronologically, as from the point of view of, say, if you were a person in West Cork, how you would have experienced it over the years. Because a sort of characteristic of this case has been the rumour, misinformation, and kind of twists that have turned the case on its head, like several times over those years, which has had the result that there are distinct groups of people who believe very strongly, one way or another, about the facts of the case, but they are basing their beliefs, their convictions, on some moment in time in this saga, where they got their sort of information and their convictions came from, where very often through our research, we would come across people who strongly felt one way or another, but were basing their beliefs on things that just weren't true. And so in terms of why, again, this is going back to your first question, why did we do this story, because there's a different set of considerations about whether you do a story when it's journalism and whether it's fiction. And obviously, it's sort of there's lots of similarities in terms of the ethics of both of them. But we saw one group of people who believed completely that this guy Ian Bailey was guilty of this murder, and that they included the Irish police force, and at the time, from our research, most of the community in West Cork. That may have changed, and it seems the French authorities also believe that. And then you have another group which includes the highest law enforcement figure in Ireland, in the land, who clearly believed that there was not the evidence to pursue a case against him. And then you have Sophie's family in France wondering, why is this case where it is? Why has nothing happened to bring their daughter's killer to justice, or their mother? And so it's sort of there was the question of how we treat this case, but the idea that there could be a question about not doing a story on it. It sort of didn't enter our minds, but I don't know if that answers your question.
No, indeed, because indeed that's why the podcast is the ideal genre for what you're talking about, because it's all about rumour. It's all about what's said, in intimacy between one person and another, and that's why the thing works so well. I thought that was really interesting. Eoin, you were talking earlier about photographs, and there's a wonderful passage in Resurrection Man, which stuck in my mind as soon as I read it. It seems to be kind of at the base of a lot of where you're coming from on this issue of real life and fiction. And you're talking about a guy called Darky, who's a character in the novel, and he compiles a dossier of photographs and articles about what's happening in Belfast, all of the murders and the violence in Belfast, and he says that there are the inevitable photograph of the civilian victim. And he says he has the impression that it's always the same man being photographed from different angles. He's always, wearing his socks are always a bit down around his ankles. There's no individuality about this person. It's kind of a mass product, the victim. And then in comparison, you say that the butchers give individuality to the death, to the victim. They give individuality. They create, indeed, a statue, if you like, of the body of several of their victims. And in so doing, they lift that person out of the anonymity of the photograph. And so the question I had was, is that another, just, you were talking about sin earlier on, but is aesthetics another justification? Because the style in which you write is totally seductive. I mean, I do not like the book. I don't like the book. I don't like the book because I was seduced by it, because it attracted me, and because I got into the rhythm of the reading, and I thought it was beautiful, whereas I knew I shouldn't. And so that really annoyed me. But it's something, and I'm wondering if it's aesthetics that is your final justification. That all of the characters talk about film. They always imagine themselves as being in a crime thriller. They're living already in a fiction, and there's this kind of inversion, if you like, between fiction and reality. And I'm wondering if that's not something to do with it.
Well, I suppose there's a lot of questions and I suppose assertions in that. I took the film, if you like, the theme. Yes, I mean, when that first occurred to me, I read the story of a 16-year-old boy walked onto a bus and shot the bus driver in the head, and he said the way he fell down, it was like a film, and that's where I came from. What I do in the book, deliberately, is take the reader by the hand and lead them down into hell, because the only way I can think of it is to express what happened. Then I'm not even still sure if I got to the bottom of it. I wanted to wrestle the idea of the place away from the narratives that were being fed to us about it. My wife, my girlfriend then, I gave her the book to read, and she read it for over an afternoon, and she put it down, and she said, it's very good. And the next thing she said was, they'll never forgive you. And I thought, well, that's good. When the film came out, we were drawing 2-page spreads in all the Tory newspapers. The producer and I, a lot of it was to do with that we were accused of being IRA sympathisers and IRA supporters.
Yes.
The producer's father was shot dead by provisional IRA. We made him a definition, not a supporter of the IRA. We went on to a television show, it was the Saturday night chat show, the Kelly show in the north. And we're slightly ambushed by the fact that they brought a young man whose father had been killed by one of the Shankill butchers onto the show. But as we went on, I said to Andrew, are you going to use the fact that your father was killed by IRA as some kind of justification or explanation of what you're doing? He said, no, that's nothing to do with all of this. I'm not going to go into that tit for tat thing. And then we went back, and the young man, he said, you're exploiting my father, you're making lots of money out of it, and all that sort of thing. And then when the cameras was turned off, he said, boys, you'd like to come for a pint? And we couldn't, you know. But we went back and we watched, one of my family had recorded it, so we went back to a flat and watched the show there. Why, I don't know, because it was a kind of car crash, really. In the company of another person whose family had been grievously injured by the Shankill butchers, so the most grievous injury you can imagine. And Andrew, whose father had been shot dead by IRA, all sitting in the same room. And what you do in this kind of fiction is try and find some way of making the reader know what it's like to be falling down that well. So I'm sorry you don't like the book, Wesley. And there was a lot of comment on the fact of the aesthetics of the book, of aestheticizing violence. And it was very deliberate. And there was also a lot of comment on the fact that you took these people and you made them human. You took the Shankill butchers and you made them human. And people say, well, but they were monsters. But the point about it is that they were not monsters. They were human beings. So what created them?
Yes, please do.
No, I spoke to Blake Morrison, and he wrote As If, which was about Jamie Bulger's death, and he covered it as a journalist at the trial. And he had a young child at the time. I think the child was 2 at the time as well, and he was struggling, with his feelings when he'd go home at night, and these 2 children were being painted as monsters, and he said, because I wanted to know, because he had insinuated himself as the moral kind of judge in the text, that the I in the text became more important than the story, and it was to make sense of the world. And he said it was exactly what you said. It was to just recalibrate the humanity of the boys. That's, what he had to do. And I think that's, what Truman Capote did was he became the presence in the book, even though he said, I never brought myself into it. There was no I mentioned. He was omniscient. He was there. It was all his view. And that what people have picked up and run with ever since is the importance of the moral pronouncement on what happened.
There was a question I had for the three of you, and it came from a remark in a thing that Niamh wrote several years ago, Blood Sisters, okay? And you say the following thing. You say, Mangan needed to make the most of the public horror at the killing that's being described in the book before complacency set in and people started to switch off. That's what you said. And I thought that was really interesting, you know, in relation to the work that was being done, you know, by the people here, because time is a real factor there, you know. And I just, you know, would like to talk about, you know, time and the relationship between the event and the writing of the thing, and how that affects or not. You're very much, the work that you did was very much immediate, you know, as it's happening. You're sitting in the courtroom, you're listening to what's going on, you're writing it down, you're putting it out. You're dealing with something that's like 22 years ago, and clearly complacency has not set in, and it's the same for yourself, you know, when you're working on things like Karen and things like that. Would you have any ideas on that, the three of you?
Well, it's just that they're eclipsed so quickly by the next crime, and that it's so important to sort of capture that moment in the moment. And like, for instance, the missing women in Ireland in the 90s, and that sort of triangle around the Wicklow Mountains, those cases are unsolved. And recently, you know, an individual, one of the girls' cases was 20 years since, you know, she's disappeared, and the same individual is in the frame, who's always been in the frame, and they are unsolved, and so it's unfinished business, and he's still out there, and yet crime becomes entertainment. Do you know what I mean? Because we so quickly move on to the next story because we don't get satisfaction in that sphere when we don't have answers. And so the whole point of that was to try and portray the guards' frustration at trying to keep the public on board, because it was only with public pressure on the politicians that resources would be put in and that the crime would hopefully be solved.
There's kind of a link into resources as well, exactly, for to keep it going, yeah. Of course.
Yeah. As you say, like with the case that we work on, it isn't. I guess it's not an issue that sort of fatigue has set in with people. You know, the case has kind of left the public imagination or anything. But there is this. You know, people would always say about this case, you know, be interviewing someone who wanted to, you know, someone who'd witnessed something that was looking forward to putting their testimony in to a criminal jury someday, and, you know, hoping for that the case would see a courtroom eventually, but you'd hear all the time, and it was it frustrated me so much to hear, like, and it's totally understandable, but so many people just say, like, you know, we'll never know who did it. This case has just been around too long. It's, you know, everyone knows this sort of maxim about whatever happens in the police work of the first 24 hours is, you know, we all know it from TV and stuff. And then also, after 22 years, there are witnesses who are dead. There's and their evidence isn't submissible in Irish courts anyway. So the time thing and the memory, you know, particularly in a case where there's no hard evidence, it's all like, yeah, I definitely said it, and a lot of in the case of Ian Bailey's being in the frame in this crime. Just as an example, there's a witness who says that he heard Ian Bailey was with him on a New Year's Eve a couple of years after the murder, and says he came into the room very upset and said, I did it, I went too far. Ian Bailey says, he didn't say that, he said, they said, I did it. And that was in 1999, I think, and so we're talking about it in 2018. I mean, it comes down to, a couple of prepositions or whatever. So, that thing of time and attention. Attention's not the problem. The problem is memory and anything that you can palpably use about the case. But yeah.
And Eoin, because the current thing resurfaced in 2000, and it had been off the radar for so long, and yet it comes back again, and there's a resolution there.
It never, it didn't really go away. Ian Hay Gordon has conviction overturned, and oddly enough, because he was found not guilty by reason of insanity, there was no guilty verdict. So they had to actually pass an act through Parliament to allow this process to happen. Well, we're just reminded of something when you talk about memory there. In the middle book of that trilogy, Orchid Blue, Patricia Kern's father, in real life, presided over the trial and subsequent hanging of the last man to be hanged on the island of Ireland, Robert McGladdery from Newry, for the murder of Pearl Gamble, a 19-year-old shop girl, same age and quite similar circumstance to the murder of his own daughter. But odd things ran through the case. McGladdery was a bit of a ne'er-do-well. He was a teddy boy, but did no direct evidence, and he maintained his innocence right to the end. But one of the things which seemed to persuade the jury was that Pearl had been murdered after a dance in Newry, in an Orange Hall in Newry. And witnesses said that McGladdery had danced, but beforehand he'd gone up to the band and asked them to play It's Now or Never. And there was almost this kind of sense that a kind of carnal ultimatum had been issued. In fact, McGladdery said, I asked him to play Chattanooga Choo Choo. That's the song that I asked him to play. But the jury went out and came back in an hour after a week of very technical evidence, and that was one of the things that contributed to it. But another thing that contributed to it, and I don't know if you have this experience, people come up to you and give you nuggets of information afterwards when the story's out there. I was doing it up in Lisburn. I was doing a talk, a reading, and a lady came up to me afterwards and said, my father was on the McGladdery jury, the jury came back in an hour. And she was a country woman, kind of quite hard to get information out of her, and that's all she really said. She said then, we had a dairy farm, and anybody who farms on a dairy farm, you have to milk the cows in the morning and the evening. It has to be done. It just has to be done. And all I remember, I was very young, that my father, how hard it was to find somebody to do this for us. I was driving home that night thinking she didn't tell me very much, and then she did. She did tell me something. She would just make me work for it. Her father was not going to sit for another 6 days in a jury room, deliberating over this ne'er-do-well from Newry. Just get him out, hang him.
So I think that it's time to thank Nora and the Centre Culturel Irlandais for having brought all of these people together, and thanking you for coming as well this evening, and thank you.